All right. Hello and welcome to what I want to say is the 7th episode of the Free Base Podcast. And I'm just recording a little introduction here for our guest who we'll be talking to today, which is Dr. Alan Williams. He's coming on again. And I just wanted to record a short introduction for him because I kind of skipped over the intro in this last episode because he was on the previous episode, but I'm realizing now that not everyone who might be watching this one has watched the last one, and I owe him an introduction. So, Dr. Alan Williams is a sixth-generation family farmer and rancher. I think he said that his family has owned that farmland since the 1840s, which is incredible. He was a researcher, he was a professor, but now he is a founding partner at Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, and Regenified. So, that's who this guest is, Dr. Alan Williams. I appreciate him very much for coming on and sharing some of his knowledge with us. And I appreciate also, I want to say how much I appreciate him coming on. You know, this is a new thing for me. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to figure this whole podcast thing out. So, you know, especially that he's come on twice now to share his knowledge with us. I just very much appreciate that. And, without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right. Dr. Williams, thank you for joining me today. Obviously, we've had you on before, so everyone knows who you are. But today we are talking about the topic that I had originally reached out to you for, which is the nutritive differences between grass-fed and grain-fed beef. So I'm hoping we can start with just kind of defining those terms. I know we talked about it a little bit, but just to start there, can we talk about what do we mean by grass-fed? What do we mean by grain-fed?
Absolutely. So when we talk about grass-fed beef, we are talking about animals that have been essentially on pasture their entire lives. They have never consumed any grain or grain byproducts, and they have had a diverse diet of what we call forages, but basically, for anybody else out there that might be confused by the term forage, we're talking about plants that are growing in the soil that our livestock will eat. Whereas when we're discussing grain fed, we're talking about animals that are finished on a grain diet. The vast majority of those that are finished that we call grain fed that are finished today are finished in what we would describe as a typical feedlot, where the animals are concentrated together into pens and their ration is brought to them multiple times a day on a daily basis and augured into feed bunks in their pens. These grain rations today are typically commonly going to be made up of, genetically modified crops, corn, soybeans. A lot of times they will add some wheat or wheat midds in there. And there can be other ingredients as well that are added in. They will have some forage base to them, some ground hay, ground alfalfa, things like that. In the industry jargon, that's called a TMR, or a total mixed ration. And so these animals don't have a choice of what they eat every day. The animals out on pasture, particularly diverse pasture, actually do. They have a choice of what they're going to eat and how much they're going to eat of each plant each day. Animals in a feedlot, it's all mixed together into this TMR, or total mixed ration. And so basically they're consuming the same thing day in and day out until they're ready to harvest.
And I had either read or watched in a video, and I don't remember which one it was, but they were saying basically that animals on diverse pasture can eat between sometimes 50 to 75 different plants every day. Although, 3 to 5 are typically what make up the bulk of their diet. How does that influence what compounds end up in the meat?
Yeah, so it influences it greatly, and you're correct. The work of Dr. Fred Provenza clearly shows that animals, when given the opportunity, when put into a diverse plant diet, they will eat 50 to 80 or even more different plant species a day, just like our wild ruminants do. Deer do that, elk do that, antelope do that, that type of thing. Um, so, and yes, they may have just a handful that comprises the bulk of the diet in any given day. But what is critical is that all of the other plants that they are eating at least a little bit of each and every day are going to be plants that have very strong phytonutrient profiles. They have powerful medicinal qualities to them and even anti-parasitic qualities, so they can essentially deworm themselves, each and every day. So the the deal here is that given the opportunity, these animals are pretty sharp. Okay, they know how to balance their own diet, and they will if they have that opportunity. But when you have very low diversity pastures or a TMR ration, the animal is not given that option. They can only eat what is presented before them. It's sort of like the difference between us going to this incredible buffet, that has 40, 50 different foods featured on the buffet, or somebody setting in front of us a plate of iceberg lettuce, and
Gotcha.
that's our dinner, and we have no choice, right? So
Mhm.
it's similar with these animals.
And you had kind of alluded to the phytonutrients or phytochemicals. I kind of want to dig into just what they are, because that's something I had a term I'd never even heard before I kind of fell down this whole rabbit hole of regenerative farming. So can we just maybe start with a basic definition, if there is one?
Absolutely. So phytonutrients, also known as phytochemicals, are naturally occurring bioactive compounds in plants. And these bioactive compounds are very powerful antioxidants and anti inflammatories. Those two things are critically important in our diet on a day in, day out basis. What we know is that practically every disease, disorder, and malady known to mankind starts with inflammation. And how it manifests itself in us as individuals then depends. So inflammation in your body may result in cancer. Inflammation in my body may result in heart disease or diabetes or high blood pressure or something else. So if we can consume foods that have very powerful phytonutrients that are anti-inflammatory, then we can prevent a lot of these diseases, disorders, and maladies. And likewise, in terms of aging and the negative effects of aging on our bodies, these antioxidants are critically important, so that we can live longer, more productive, more healthy lives if we're consuming more antioxidants. Now, likewise, both these antioxidants and anti-inflammatories are very important in the diet of animals because it has the same positive impact in animals, whether it's our livestock or domesticated or wild animals, as it does us. So many, many studies out there, peer-reviewed studies, have found that these phytochemicals, or what we call phytonutrients, play an absolutely critical role in the prevention and management of many chronic diseases.
And from what I've read, the the grass fed on diverse pastures is what has the highest concentration of phytochemicals. I'm curious of a grain fed animal that's being fed, like you said, this GMO grain that I don't know the science behind it, but I'm assuming every corn plant is essentially genetically the same. They're all grown in soils that are, fairly depleted. Does that have an effect on the phytonutrient content of the beef produced when fed, GMO grains from depleted soils?
Absolutely. One of the things that we have found is that from this research, and this has been led by Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and his team of researchers. So I definitely want to give them, a huge shout out here, and tons of credit for the work that they have done. And we've just been blessed to be participatory in this research with Dr. Van Vliet and his team. Dr. Fred Provenza also has been very critical in all of this, with the prior work that he has done and the guidance that he has provided in this more current research. So both of those gentlemen have been huge in, being able to produce the data and the other things that I'm going to share with you today. But
And I'm sorry, just as a quick side note, I will link Dr. Provenza's book,
yes,
Nourishment, and also I believe when you talk about Stefan Van Vliet, you're talking about the beef nutrient density project. I could link that as well at the bottom.
absolutely, yes,
But I'm
and
sorry.
that would be great. So there are two very clear things that are pretty definitive that we have found in the results of much of this research that Dr. Van Vliet has been doing and that Dr. Fred Provenza did for many years. One of those is that the degree of plant species diversity and functional group diversity, and I'll explain that in just a moment, matters a lot. Okay, in terms of building in these phytonutrient compounds into the foods that we eat. So the more diverse the plant species are, and the more different functional groups that exist. And functional groups are things like grasses would be one functional group, legumes would be another, forbs would be another, and woody or brushy species would be another. And when animals are able to eat from a multiplicity of plant functional groups, they're going to have a lot more phytonutrients imparted, into the meat, the milk, the eggs, whatever we may consume. Likewise, another key here is the biological status of the soil. So the more biological active and the better that biological profile is in the soil, then the more phytonutrients there are that are going to be imparted into the plants and then into the animals that consume those plants, or even the people that consume those plants. So, healthy soil and diverse plants are absolute keys here. And the more we have of both of those, the research is very, very clear. The more phytonutrient compounds we're going to have in the foods that we eat.
And we lack essentially all this in grain fed beef fed with the traditional monocropped grains.
Yes, and I'll share some data here with you, but from Dr. Van Vliet's studies. But first and foremost, if we look at total phytochemicals and antioxidants in forages versus TMRs, those total mixed rations, it's pretty astounding. There is no doubt that diverse pastures have a far, far greater phytochemical and antioxidant content in them than the TMR rations do. There, as a matter of fact, when you look at bar graphs that present this, the TMR rations, the bar graphs barely get above the bottom bar, the bottom axis.
Mm.
Uh, and now, are there differences in the meat from the pasture fed, the grass fed? Yes, but they all are significantly higher than the TMR fed. And that's been shown over and over repeatedly. The highest levels that we find are from the soils that are the most biologically active and the pastures that have the greatest array of plant species diversity. So the more we have of both of those, the more phytonutrients and antioxidants we're going to have in the foods that we eat.
And you talk about these different functional groups. I think you said grasses, forbs, legumes, and the woody plants.
Right.
My question is, do those impart a different array of phytochemicals than, say, because you can get phytochemicals from eating vegetables? Would those provide you with different phytochemicals than just eating, like the phytochemicals you might find in the vegetables in a salad? Does it make sense what I'm trying to ask?
Yes, it does. And so I'll start with saying, first of all, yes, there are different arrays of phytochemicals or phytonutrients in the proteins versus a lot of the vegetables. They aren't necessarily the same. Okay, and they're not always the same at all. So this is why we also, just like it benefits our livestock and our wildlife to eat a much broader array or diversity of foods each and every day, the same with us. If our diet is very limited in the foods that we eat every day, then we are going to be self-limiting ourselves with the phytonutrients that we're consuming. The second thing that I would say is that a tomato is not a tomato, a cucumber is not a cucumber, a blueberry is not a blueberry. They themselves are going to vary radically depending upon the biological activity of the soil that they were grown in, and the diversity of the plant species that grow in that soil each year. So let's say, in a garden, in a certain area of the garden, you only plant tomatoes year in and year out. Well, you're going to have a limited soil biology in that soil where you only plant tomatoes. And because you only plant tomatoes, that's limited diversity in plant species in that same garden. So you're actually limiting the amount of phytonutrients that can be imparted into that tomato that you eat. So there is a radical difference in vegetables and fruit and nuts and all of that as well, depending upon how they were grown and raised and the soils in which they were grown. So we can't just assume that because it's a plant, all plants have the same phytonutrient profile. They don't. Some have a far worse phytonutrient profile if they're grown more conventionally, or they're grown in soils that are tilled a lot and that have a poor biological profile.
And I think you've already kind of partially answered this question, but my next question is, are the phytochemicals that you find in plants, are they largely determined by the environment and the soil, or is it species of plants are generally have certain profiles?
Now, every plant will vary radically in its phytonutrient profile depending upon the soil in which it was grown. So we can't just say that, again, because it's a blueberry, using that as an example, that all blueberries have the same phytonutrient profile. They absolutely do not. So the health of the soil matters a lot. And when I say the health, let me make this very clear. I am not talking about the health that you're going to see relative to what is typically called soil fertility, the elements that are immediately plant available that we see on a standard soil test. That's not what I'm talking about at all when I say soil health. That's not indicative of healthy soil. Okay, healthy soil has to have healthy biology. And that's what we need to be measuring and paying attention to, because the biology has the ability to be able to cycle these nutrients and make them plant available. And if all we're doing is buying and applying fertility over top, that soil is never as healthy as a biologically rich soil.
And so the phytochemical content of plants is largely determined by the biology in the soil, essentially.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct. And that's why we must start paying a lot more attention to soil biology and not just simply soil chemistry. What we typically have been taught over the last 8+ decades is pure soil chemistry only, and that's it. And we ignore the biology of the soil. We don't even think about it. We haven't even been taught to think about it. And what we now find from this phytonutrient research is that the soil biology is actually far more important than the soil chemistry. And the reason being, biology drives the chemistry, not the other way around. We've acted as if chemistry drives biology. No, biology drives chemistry. That's the signal for the chemical reactions that are going to occur in the soil. And they trigger all of that. Biology actually releases a lot of enzymes, that solubilizes bound elements in the soil and makes them plant available. And it makes them plant available on a just-in-time, just-as-needed basis upon signals from the plants as they release root exudates that feed and signal the microbes to say the plant through the root exudate says to the microbes, I'm feeding you and my exudates are telling you exactly what I need. You go gather what I need and you feed back to me. And that's how this has worked for millennia. We interrupted this with
Mm-hmm.
with all of our newer, fertilizers and chemicals and everything else. We interrupted that natural process and have been doing so now for 100+ years, interrupting this process. And I want to say something here relative to that. So there's a lot of peer-reviewed research that clearly indicates that over the last several decades, that nutritive density in every food that we're consuming as a human has declined significantly. Vegetables, fruits, nuts, animal proteins, all of the nutrient density has declined significantly. Now, to me, the irony in that is this. We have been taught over the last several decades that our ability to add fertilizers back to the soil, feeds the soil and builds in nutrients. Really? Well, if that's the case, and we've been applying ever increasing amounts of fertilizer over the last several decades, we haven't decreased our fertilizer use. We have increased it globally substantially over the last several decades. And yet nutrient density is steadily declining. So that's the question I will pose to the audience is why? If purchased and applied fertilizers are supposed to do the job for us and apply everything that plant needs and then build in the nutrients for us, why is it not working? Why are we seeing this steady decline? But the total polar opposite of that from these phytonutrient studies is that what we are seeing is that these soils without any added fertilizer, okay, none, no purchased and applied fertilizers whatsoever. These soils that are biologically rich and have great diversity in plant species are producing phytonutrient richness that far surpasses what we're seeing in the conventionally produced foods.
And I think anyone could understand this because if you eat strawberries that you buy at the grocery store or versus stopping at a roadside stand and eating those strawberries, they're almost different fruits. Just a quick anecdote. I went to Puerto Rico this last winter and they have like fruit stands on the sides of the road. And I would buy 2 bunches of bananas every single day because it's like a different fruit than the one that you find at the grocery store when you're just talking about flavor. And I would imagine that has a lot to do with the soil it was grown in, and factors like that.
Yeah, that's the beauty, Luke, of these phytonutrient rich foods is not only are they fantastic for us from a health standpoint, but phytonutrient rich foods also have a far greater and more robust flavor profile. so they're more pleasing to our palate, and they satiate us a lot quicker than these more conventionally produced foods. So we are seeing exactly that. A strawberry once again tastes like a strawberry rather than wet cardboard. You know, I,
They
the
look pretty in the grocery store. They don't taste like
well,
much though.
well, they look pretty on the outside,
Hmm.
but when you slice these strawberries open, they're white on
Hmm.
the inside.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but a good strawberry should never ever be white on the inside. And I grew up on my family's farm in South Carolina, and we were in the heart of peach country. Okay, and we actually had a little peach orchard ourselves, and then in South Carolina at that point in time was the largest producer of fresh peaches in the United States. And I remember as a kid, when the peaches were ripening, you could smell them from quite a ways away,
Hmm.
and then when you would eat the peach, you would bite into those peaches, and the juice would just dribble down your chin and dribble down your hand and your forearm. They were incredibly juicy,
Hmm.
and the flavor was just fabulous. Just like you were talking about buying all the bananas, right?
Right.
I mean, it was hard to quit eating those peaches every day. They were
Yeah.
that good. But you go to the grocery store today and you buy a peach, and first of all, I can put it all the way up to my nose and not even smell a peach aroma, right?
Hmm.
Then when you bite into it, you feel like you're almost going to chip your tooth. They're so hard. And there's no juice. No juice dribbles down your chin, no juice dribbles down your forearm. And they're so hard, I could take one and throw it at somebody and knock them out with it. They're like a rock. And to me, that's a travesty. How did we get there? How did we get there that most consumers think that's normal? Like the bananas, they think the bananas they're eating in most grocery stores today are normal. The peaches are normal.
Tasting a locally grown banana has completely ruined eating bananas in Illinois for me. I just can't. I can't even eat them anymore. It was that huge of a difference. Um, but yeah, it's weird that we're so, because in some ways we are concerned about the food we eat. We're the only fruits and vegetables that make it into the grocery stores are the absolute perfect specimens with no defects and any of that. But when it comes to flavor, it seems that we could care less. At least that's the way we behave as consumers. Um,
Well, we've been taught that, we've been trained that way as consumers, right? That a fruit or a vegetable should have absolutely no blemish on it whatsoever, should look perfect on the outside. And again, the average consumer today has honestly no idea what I would call a real tomato, a real peach, a real banana, a real blueberry tastes like. No idea.
yeah, and you brought up the smell, how you could smell the peaches as soon as you came near them. I used to work on a farm. It was a hops farm. Like they grew hops that grow in a beer, but we also had like a 7 acre garden. And I mean, we had like a whole field full of basil that just, the smell was so strong, and all the different fields had different smells. And that was a cool place to work. Um, do you want to talk a little bit about the difference in the flavor profiles of grass fed versus grain fed?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're finding is that the grass fed, particularly those finished, in diverse pastures in biologically rich soils, have this incredible complexity to their flavor profile. Just unbelievable robustness, and it's when you eat it, it's unmistakable. Whereas, unfortunately, a lot of the beef produced from a TMR ration is a lot more bland. It just doesn't have the robustness and that rich flavor profile that the well finished grass fed beef does. Um, the other thing that we note is particularly in animal beef that is finished from a TMR that contains DDGs, dried distillers grains. And for those that may not know, dried distillers grains, or DDGs, are the byproduct of ethanol production from corn for our fuels. And these, because it's a cheap byproduct, are now being put into many rations, not just for beef cattle, but for dairy cattle, for our commercial pork, our commercial chicken, our commercial eggs, all of that. And what we have found is that these DDGs produce a very bland flavor profile in the end product. And in that end product, you have to add back sauces, seasonings, marinades, spices, whatever, to be able to add flavor back to it, because the flavor is just so bland. Whereas with this rich pasture raised beef, there's really no seasoning at all, no marinades, no anything needed. The complexity of the flavor profile in the meat alone stands alone. It's that robust. And if you want to add anything at all, we never add anything more than just simple salt, sea salt, and ground pepper, and that's it, if we add anything, because you simply don't need to add anything else to add flavor. As a matter of fact, what you don't want to add much, because in these rich grass-fed products, you don't want to mask the flavor. The original flavor is so good. So that is certainly something that we're seeing. I did some work with Mark Schatzker, and Mark is the author of 3 books: Steak, The Dorito Effect, and The End of Craving. And I highly recommend people read all 3 of those books. And he also was a regular on the Dr. Oz show. And Mark and I did quite a bit of testing a few years back, and found that in diets that contain a lot of DDGs, so these feedlot diets where they're using a lot of DDGs, or where they're using them in commercial swine, commercial poultry, commercial dairy rations, they are producing a way out of proportion omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the end product. We found omega-6 to omega-3 ratios in beef, as an example, from beef animals finished on a DDG-based diet, to be anywhere from a 40-to-1 to a 55-to-1 omega-6 to 3 ratio. That's the American Medical Association recommends our daily diet be a 4-to-1 omega-6 to 3 ratio. The average American diet is between a 20-to-1 and a 25-to-1, so we're way out of proportion. And then these diets from animal proteins that are fed DDGs are even worse than that. And the reason we don't want a lot of omega-6s in our diet is because omega-6s can cause extreme inflammation in our bodies if they're way too out of proportion with the omega-3s. So that's what we're experiencing, and that's one of the reasons we're beginning to see a greater and greater spike in all types of diseases, disorders, and maladies. We've got a way out of whack omega-6 to 3 ratio in our daily diet.
And what do omega-3s do? Like, you hear the words omega-3s and omega-6s. What's the different structure and different purposes of these 2 different fatty acids?
Yeah, so both are essential in our diet, but it's like a lot of things in our diet. More of one is almost never better. We can overdose on vitamins. We can overdose on minerals. And many people are doing that today by taking supplementary vitamins and minerals, as individuals. And they're not even realizing that they can create toxicities and issues in their bodies, because all vitamins and minerals and all nutrients in the bodies, including these phytonutrients, have to be in proportion to each other. and the fatty acids that we're consuming have to be in the proper proportion to each other. And it's very hard to do that through supplementation. We need to be doing that through our daily diet, through the foods that we consume. So, omega-3s, I mean, most people are very familiar with omega-3s, or at least they believe they are. But, omega-3s are powerful anti-inflammatories, antioxidants, so they really help to reduce a lot of diseases and disorders and maladies that we experience when we can consume the proper amount of omega-3s in our diet, along with other favorable fatty acids. There's many other favorable fatty acids we need to be consuming as well, such as conjugated linoleic acids, also known as CLAs. But the issue becomes when the omega-6s are far greater in our diet than the omega-3s, and that is exactly what is occurring in the typical American diet today. And omega-6s, out of proportion to the omega-3s, produce significant and even severe inflammation in our bodies. And that inflammation starts in our gut and then spreads throughout the rest of our body. And over time, that day in, day out inflammation that we may not even recognize as occurring begins to produce the signs and symptoms of many of the diseases that we know that we're afflicted with today.
What is metabolic syndrome? It's a term I've been hearing a lot recently, but I don't really understand it.
Well, it's just issues with our metabolism and ability to be able to, have a fully functioning metabolism. That's part of and Mark Schatzker, in both the Dorito effect and the end of craving, actually covers a lot of this. And he covers the history of food and where we went wrong, and how today, with all of the additives and all of the fake fats and the fake sweeteners and everything else that we have been told are actually good for us, and they're actually very terrible for us. In Mark's two books, again, the Dorito effect and the end of craving clearly spell this out. He's got all the research in there on that. But what we find is that because of the foods that we're eating today and their significant lack in phytonutrients, our bodies are not getting satiated. So this radically alters our metabolism. And we want to eat more, way more than we should, because we're not reaching the point of satiety. So what we are finding is that with these phytonutrient-rich foods like grass-fed beef, pastured poultry, pastured eggs, pastured pork, and plant foods grown in biologically rich soils, you reach a point of satiety a lot quicker. And therefore, we have a far better functioning metabolism, a more properly functioning metabolism.
Another question I had for you: do you eat organ meat?
Oh, absolutely. And we all should. Organ meats, when you look at total nutrient density per ounce of food consumed, there is no other food on the face of the earth, period, that is as nutrient dense as organ meats from animals. And, for centuries, even millennia, indigenous populations knew this. This was inherent in their knowledge. Whenever they killed a bison or an elk or a deer or whatever it happened to be, the very first thing they would consume would be the organ meats and the fat. They never threw fat away. They never, like we do today, they never trimmed fat off and threw that away. That was prized. And the most important members in a tribe, for instance, got the organ meats and the fat because they knew that was where the richest nutrients were. and so none of that was ever wasted, but today we tend to throw all of that away as Americans, and we have shut organ meats and animal fats out of our diet to our detriment. We need to be consuming a lot more organ meats and a lot more good animal fat.
So what is the way to introduce people who would be very reluctant to eat organs, myself included? I can't get myself to do it. I know I want to, but even just touching it, what's the simple recipe in something easy, a good way to get some organ meat in you?
Absolutely. Great question. And the answer is this: it is, organ blend burgers, or what we also call ancestral burger. And we ourselves produce a lot of this and sell a lot of this. And there's a lot of other, farmers and ranchers that in branded programs that do this as well. So basically, what I'm talking about here is a blend of organ meats in with regular hamburger. So you never even know the organ meats are in there. You don't taste them, because of the blend. And so you don't have any kind of off putting flavors, anything like that. And they are, blended in. And even kids love this. We have done this with a lot of kids, taste tested, given them the option where they have regular hamburger on a plate, and then the organ burger on the plate, and just little squares of each with toothpicks in them, and just the meat alone, no condiments, anything else, and the kids can try. And every single time these kids will tell you, right? The
Mm-hmm.
knowledge of kids is huge. And they have always, every single time we've done this, they always say wow to the organ burger, and they always tell us they like it better than the other every time. Uh, and so they don't even notice that there's liver and kidney and heart and all of that in there, and they think the flavor is a whole lot better. I eat tons of that. I far prefer the organ blend burger myself to just regular hamburger. To me now, regular hamburger is sort of bland. The robustness of the flavor profile of the organ burger is just so head and shoulders above the regular trim.
Well, I would imagine that has to do with your body recognizing that this food contains a lot of nutrients that it needs, and then whatever those feedback loops are. I'm rereading Fred Provenza's book again. I'm trying to get more acquainted with that. The feedback, the biological feedback loops associated with, I shouldn't even try to describe it, but I will say that the organ blend burgers are definitely something that I could do. And I should buy some of that stuff.
Yeah, it like I said, they are really, really good. You don't notice, you just think it's a better burger.
Mm-hmm.
It's all you think. And yes, your body does tell you. So, because the majority of foods I eat are foods that are produced from our farm, right? My body knows that and recognizes that. So, whenever I'm on the road traveling and doing workshops and soil health academies and all of that, and we have to eat like in a restaurant or something, my body tells me pretty quickly within 10 to 15 minutes after that meal, why did you eat that? What did you do to me? It really does. And it's that quick. And I know, wow, man, I shouldn't have eaten that. And so on the road, we are intentionally looking and seeking out restaurants that, are like farm to table, things like that, and where we have known sourcing of the foods that I'm going to buy and eat. Um, and we even, most of the time now, we carry a lot of food with us so we can do our own cooking,
Sure.
just because it's incredibly hard. in a restaurant to find, foods that are any good, to be honest with you, and particularly foods that are phytonutrient rich. That's incredibly hard to find in a restaurant nowadays.
Yeah, and being on the road a lot, I would imagine that is it's hard just to eat what most people would call healthy when you're traveling, let alone when you specifically are looking for these foods that are phytonutrient rich and grown in healthy soils. I can imagine that gets almost impossible.
Yep, absolutely it does.
So I actually only have one more question written down for you. This one is the one I've been kind of saving because it's the one I'm most excited about. Um, are there any implications of grass-fed beef being used to enhance performance and recovery in performance and recovery in athletes? I'm thinking of someone who maybe is an athlete, maybe weight lifts as a hobby or exercises as a hobby, someone who's developing a skill, progressively overloading their bodies, um, and yeah, has to not only perform well, but recover from that performance so they can get in tomorrow and do the same thing.
So the short answer to that is yes. And more performance athletes are discovering, pasture raised proteins and the tremendous benefits that they produce for them in their diet and their performance. So there are quite a few world class athletes now that are actively incorporating pastured proteins, like grass fed beef and pastured pork, eggs, so forth, into their daily diet. There are both collegiate and professional sports teams that are now incorporating these pastured proteins into their daily diet, uh, and have discovered the benefits. There are quite a few of the professional strength athletes that are
Oh shoot,
absolutely doing this.
I lost you for a minute. Could you go back a little bit? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So yes, what we're seeing a lot of performance athletes that are now incorporating pastured proteins into their daily diet.
Okay.
We are seeing this in many of the world class strength athletes. Many of those that compete in the strongman competitions are now consuming pastured proteins on a routine basis. And we also are seeing both collegiate and professional sports teams that have incorporated pastured proteins into their diets. So, yes, they have discovered the benefits and they are taking advantage of them.
Are you familiar with any specific compounds that would facilitate these improvements? Like I can think of, I heard grass-fed beef has higher levels of creatine. That's something that I supplement. Are there any specific compounds that would lead to these performance increases and increased recovery?
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a few, and for instance, there's hipparate, catechol sulfate. There are things like ergothioneine, histidine, betaine, things like that, that are compounds that are highly, highly beneficial, uh, along with the fatty acid profiles. One of these far more favorable fatty acid profiles have proven to be very beneficial in these strength athletes' diets as well. And we're seeing this, for instance, in uh, things like the omega 3s, the omega 6 to 3 ratio. Obviously, for an athlete, for recovery, one of the things that's most critical is quick recovery, right? And repair of the muscles and all of this. And so, they need a really, really good omega 6 to 3 ratio in their diet to be able to accomplish that. If they're experiencing inflammation on top of, the damage they did through their athletic competition and their training, then that just exasperates things. So they need basically a their total phenolic con, uh, consumption needs to go up. So all of the phytonutrient compounds, and then the what we need to see, there are certain oxidative stress markers in the body, like homocysteine. Okay, we want to see lower homocysteine levels in the body, and we're seeing significantly lower homocysteine levels with people that are consuming pastured proteins versus conventionally produced proteins. There's another indicator of oxidative stress in the body that's called 4-HNE, and we're seeing significantly lower 4-HNE levels in people that are consuming these pasture proteins versus those that are consuming more conventionally produced proteins.
It's very interesting. Personally myself, I'm currently on my journey to introducing more locally grown, more regeneratively grown foods and proteins into my diet. But the thing that really gets me excited about it is the idea that if I start eating a lot of these foods, might hit some new PRs. You never know. And the health benefits sound great too, but it's that's the one that gets me. So whatever
Well,
works.
absolutely. And and just to share just a little bit of data here, in key phytonutrients in grass-fed beef, what we're finding is that depending on the phytonutrient class, we're seeing grass-fed beef have anywhere from 57% to 85% higher phytonutrient content in all of these key antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. In terms of vitamins and the vitamin content in the grass-fed beef versus the grain-fed, we are seeing vitamin content anywhere from 27% to 64% higher. Now, the ironic thing about that, and I have to point this out, is that every TMR ration, those animals are being supplemented with a vitamin mineral pre-pack. So they are being fed supplemental vitamins. The grass-fed animals are not. They're not being supplemented with vitamins at all. And yet, in the end product that we're consuming, the grass-fed beef is still significantly higher in vitamin E, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin in the B vitamins, and all of that than the grain fed, um, even though the grain fed are supplemented. So why is that? You know that's a question we have to ask ourselves. And then if we look at the fatty acid profiles in terms of favorable fatty acids, we're anywhere from 50% to over 100% higher in favorable fatty acids in the grass fed compared to the grain fed, with a significantly lower omega 6 to omega 3 fatty acid ratio.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share?
I'll just share this that this research is ongoing. There will be a lot of peer reviewed publications coming out of this, and we'll be summarizing a lot of that as it comes out on our website at understandingag.com and making that available to the general public. Dr. Van Vliet and his team have also repeated this in dairy, and we're finding very, very similar results in the dairy side as well. So, and what we're finding is that once again on the dairy side, the more biologically rich the soil and the more diverse the pasture diet that the animals are eating, they are the fatty acid and phytonutrient profiles are just off the charts higher compared to dairy cows fed a TMR diet. So again, this is holding true through a multiplicity of foods, and Dr. Van Vliet and his team are continuing to look at a whole array of foods that are showing similar results. So, we plan to make this available to the public, and hopefully change a lot of minds and equip people to be able to pick foods that are going to be far more healthy and nutrient dense.
That all sounds great. I think that's a great mission. I appreciate your time today, and I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. Well, thank you.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Luke. As always, I really enjoy being on with you, and anytime.
Great. All right.